All right. Um, hey everyone. Welcome to Race, Crime, and Justice. This is week five. This is the week five lecture where we're talking about race and policing. This is also chapter five of the book. Um, as I mentioned in the intro video, um, the subject of this particular chapter is very heavy and not easy to talk about. So we're going to try to be kind, conscientious, and aware, and we are going to talk about a difficult subject. So, if you've looked at the PowerPoint, the notes already, you know that there's not a whole lot written here, but there's a lot to talk about. And so, brief history, we're not a history class. If you want to learn more about this, uh, take our history class. But so, a very brief history of policing and race. If you've taken intro to criminal justice, you're familiar that the idea of modern policing and how we do all those sorts of things actually does come from the kind of British system. The A lot of our modern day criminal justice components are rooted in old English uh, common law and sheriffs and things of that nature. But it's partly because we started as a colony of the empire. Great Britain at one point ruled the world. They owned almost everything, so a lot of our stuff comes from that. But on top of that, and in particular related to what we're talking about today and how race and policing works together, um, really we're gonna look at it as a pre-Civil War time and a post-Civil War time. Simply because if I'm, I have to safely assume that at this point, if you're in a college class, you've had the basics of American history, and you know that the Civil War, the fight between the North and the South, there was a large component centered around slavery, which was the ownership of white ownership of African American individuals by white landowners. Um, Not a fair system at all, but that's why we need to separate it into a pre-Civil War and a post-Civil War. And so pre-Civil War, we are looking at slavery, and there were particular laws and rules in place in this time in history, specifically about runaway slaves. So there were slave codes, and our text does a pretty good job doing a very brief overview of the history as well. Um, it's literally what the first two pages, like page 93, remembering the past. Page 93 to 94 is just the brief history, and it's the highlights of what we're talking about. So yeah, pre-Civil War and during the Civil War, there were specific rules in place that essentially made sure that police officers were given the right to uh, capture and return a slave to the original slave owner. Um, Obviously, you don't want to kill them because that's destroying someone's property. Not that that's correct, but that is how they viewed that situation. After the Civil War, anyone who knows American history knows that it did not just get rid of any kind of inequality and didn't make everyone equal and free. The idea was that the end of the Civil War saw a removal of slavery. So now African Americans were free people, but they weren't equal at this point. We don't see that until the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, and we'll talk about that in a second. But in that post Civil War time, there were black codes, and some of them, if you know your American history, you might know some of them, and that's the segregated drinking fountains, schools, things of that nature to keep the two groups separate. Um, there were rules, and some of those rules essentially allowed officers to uh, treat individuals of color harsher than they would a white individual, simply because the idea was that because of the color of the skin, they are lesser. Obviously, that is not true, but that is how they viewed that. And even in the pre-Civil War times, there is this concept that we need to just briefly talk about again. If it was a history class, we'd go way deeper into this, but we're trying to, get to the modern era. Jim Crow. The Jim Crow laws and the Jim Crow era in the United States is all about this happy slave ideal. And it's really, it's hard to talk about, especially as a white professor talking about this. But please know I'm talking in the historical context. Um, the concept of the Jim Crow was that it was a black man who was okay with slavery, was okay and longed for a time like that. And so Jim Crow was always that kind of white appeaser. And so there were Jim Crow laws that forced individuals of color to either be really nice to white people or get in trouble, and among a million of other issues. The point here being that all the way up until the 1960s, when we saw the civil rights movement, there was so much in place, legally speaking, that was directed towards people of color. And while we've talked about it a little bit last week, it's important to bring up, while the focus of our conversation this week and the book focuses heavily on African Americans, it's important to note that before the civil rights movement, which was primarily behind the African Americans, it did for so many other groups as well, but there are historically, we already talked about Native Americans last week. The Latinx community has had a serious issue with the way police handle them. Um, and even if we look at just generalized racism in the embeddedness of our country, in the development of the railroad system, we used Asian immigrants as labor, and we also, you know, greatly were racist against the Irish and put them to work. And there's a whole lot of issues of people of varying backgrounds being exploited. And so when we've talked about it before and we're talking about it again here, the United States, its history is deeply steeped in racism and how it was formed. And that's not to say that everyone in America is racist. That's not what we're saying. But what we're saying is that the history of the nation itself is deeply rooted in a lot of racism and sexism. So, 1960s, we get the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X, and several other individuals who pushed for reform and equality. And that kind of movement, that civil rights movement, led to, and it's, as a member of the LGBTQIA plus community, the community always likes to point to certain protests as where it all began, but they tend to forget, and every group tends to forget, that if it wasn't for the civil rights movement, the other movements wouldn't have happened. Um, so it's important to note that in the 1960s, the civil rights movement, that is the big turning point in the way law enforcement played a role in these racist ideas about how individuals are treated. And the way I mean that is that because of the civil rights movement, we were given laws and rules that were in place that essentially guaranteed that just because you had a different skin color didn't mean you deserved to be beaten. Just because you have a different ethnic background means that you are allowed to be punished more severely or that you weren't considered human. The civil rights movement made sure that no matter who you were, if you were a citizen of the United States, you were to be seen as an equal. Well, again, until we had the women's right movement that allowed women to feel that way, originally it was just men. But this is what I'm saying. 1960s civil rights movement kind of ended that black code, Jim Crow era, slave codes. But, and where we are now, is in this implicit bias movement. And that's where we are now. So that's the very brief history. Hopefully you knew most of those things already because they're, well, you may not have like focused extremely on any one of those probably should have been highlights in your history of the United States. So understanding the discrimination that we see, specifically remember now that we're in the post-civil rights movement, we're in the implicit bias, and we've talked about implicit bias before, but just a reminder, implicit bias is that we have an innate, under the surface belief in things that are may or may not be actually true, but based off of our experiences and our knowledge. And we make those decisions right away. So that's implicit bias. We'll get into that in a little bit, but understanding the discrimination, uh, one of the most depressing realities of being an intelligent human being and understanding statistics and research is learning the term statistically significant. Statistically significant means that according to the data and the research available, that there may be a connection that we see in the numbers, but the numbers aren't fair enough to say for certain 100% that this is that. And so because of that issue, because of significance in statistics, scholars dispute the extent of discrimination in the modern criminal justice system. The data itself can be looked at. Some people take the stance that it's a myth. The modern system itself is not racist in any way. It's just our own biases coming up saying, oh, look at that. Yeah, clearly that shows the truth. And then, the other side of that, the most crime is black on black crime, white on white crime. The data says, yeah, that's true, but statistically significantly speaking, there's an issue. So the logic behind modern CJ is not discriminatory based on race. That's a myth. But the other side looks at that data and goes, this is a very racist and deliberate system. The criminal justice system itself was founded to put down the person of color, and it still does that. If you are either one of those viewpoints, that's okay. That is your prerogative. That is your right as a citizen to have your own unique perspective on it. For the purposes of this class and for understanding the complexities of this issue, I'm asking that we take the middle perspective that the textbook takes and that we're going to be using in discussion. So, the middle perspective is a focal concerns perspective. And that is the idea that racial discrimination in the criminal justice system stems from implicit biases and racial stereotypes in American society that assume people of color, particularly young African American males, are prone to violent crime. This is an idea that we are familiar with, at least from the focal concerns perspective, that this issue is part of the overall system. Another piece with all this is the understanding that how we view this middle perspective, we have to view it as police might treat individuals of color more harshly. Again, I'm sure most of you in this class, as well as I, can bring up multiple cases of harsh treatment towards a person of color, especially by police. I'm sure that that is possible. But for the purposes of our conversation and understanding of this book, we're going to try to take this middle perspective where we see it's not that the system is wrong, it's that implicit biases and racial stereotypes that are still used in today's American society is what leads to this. So the other unintentional issue with this that I wanted to bring up in particular is that assumption that young African American males are prone to violent crimes. There have been several studies on this, which makes it even more depressing. And I was watching something the other day that uh, it was a YouTube short, but it was from one of those research uh, channels. Anyway, they did a study that found that uh, biases based off of young African American males starts as young as preschool, not just with police, where teachers were asked to look and monitor for any potential child interruptions and disruptions to class, and uh, that wasn't what they were actually studying. They were studying habits of teachers, and they found that they were more cautious and attentive to young African American boys uh, when under the guise that watch for potential problems. So we see that there is this kind of shorthand that African American males are dangerous. It becomes shorthand culturally that that's just what it is. For most people, if you ask them, what does a gangster look like? You could get, the traditional classic white Italian mafia guy. But the other side of that could be young black man in a gang or drug dealer. We equate that even though it's not accurate, but it becomes that shorthand for not just officers, not just people within the system, it's for the everyday common people. And that's a problem. And that's what this book tries to put forward is like, this is a big, over encompassing issue. Um, but when we take this view that police might treat individuals of color more harshly, we need to talk about a particular movement. We need to talk about so the idea there is that not all officers are all out racists. Some are just unintended racial discrimination, and so our textbook in particular, and I wrote it down and I blocked it out specifically. So on page 96, and if you know what ACAB means, we are going to talk a little bit about that today because it's important. But um, so on page 96, under implicit bias and entrenched discrimination, in that very first paragraph, in fact, national survey evidence finds that white police officers are 9 times more likely than white civilians to think African Americans are more violent than whites. To acknowledge that any discrimination criminal justice professionals commit is usually unintended is not meant to excuse their behavior, but it is meant to acknowledge that well intentioned people may still sometimes act in a wrong headed manner. And so, knowing that not everyone is an out an all out racist, but it might be the way the overall system works and not just the criminal justice system but our social system, that leads to a bigger conversation. And so that's where I get into this is a particular movement that we need to talk about in this class and in this chapter because it's directly related to the police and it has currently some strong connections to people of color. And so that is the ACAB movement. And if you don't know what that stands for, apologies now. It stands for All Cops Are Bastards. The idea behind this movement is that anyone who is a law enforcement agent who the basic idea that people use it for is that there's no such thing as a good cop. They're all corrupt, terrible, racist individuals. That's not the origins of it, but that is what it's come to equate to. The real concept behind it is that the system itself is corrupt and designed for this kind of bad acting, this bad decision making. But the individuals in it, there are bad apples, but they're not all bad. It's the system that puts them in that position. Whether you agree with it, that view or not, that is where this roots in. And real quickly, I'm going to actually bring up a web page that I'm sure you never thought a teacher was going to be bringing up. So hold on one second. And back. Yeah, Wikipedia. So, Wikipedia, any teacher that told you Wikipedia is terrible, don't ever use it, they're not wrong, but they're not right. Wikipedia is a great place to start research, especially when they have, in particular, footnotes. They will tell you where they got the information, so it's reliable. But here we're talking about the ACAB movement, as I've already explained. This started in Britain in the 1920s. That is the historical thing. It's been used by criminals, gang members. The punk movement repurposed it and took it as part of their anti-establishment subculture. Punk and skinheads, yeah, here in the 1980s. We saw a resurgence of this in particular, especially in the United States, in 2020 after George Floyd. And that's why this is relevant to this, is that this was already used by anti-police individuals and people that are very anti-government, anti a lot of these things. And so already had a strong movement, but after George Floyd was murdered, that led to this becoming a uh, very outright and kind of focused piece. To use a very weird phrase, it was the straw that broke the camel's back. The murder of George Floyd was just too many abuses of the use of force in apprehending African Americans that it led to a more broad acceptance of this idea. It's no longer just for the extremists. There are people who are not extremists that believe in the ACAB movement. And so it's important to note in this context that we are talking about a movement that is formed in hate, but does have some legitimacy to it because it is a response to some truly terrible things that have happened. So, the next thing that we need to talk about is police and the idea of policing. And so the text breaks it down into three sections: stop and searches, arrests, and the use of force, and in particular how it relates to the individual races and, well, specifically African American men and some of the data related to that. But this is where I put the disclaimer that the rest of this discussion is going to bring up several options, because if you notice, this is the last slide. So we're going to be talking about several different examples that the text brings up, and there's enough from them that I don't think we need to have additional outside readings. If you choose to, you can, and it's related to the discussion board. But Um, we're going to be talking about this. So, police and policing, we need to talk about the way that they interact and what the roles of police and policing are. So, for those of you who may not be CJ students or not traditionally CJ students, um, there are several different things that police have duty wise and things they can do. Stop and search is just very basic explanation is where an officer stops an individual who may be suspect of committing a crime or potential to commit a crime and search their person for any kind of weapon, paraphernalia, whatever it may be that would help them commit a crime. So the idea is you stop and you search an individual. Arrests are obviously a component of if someone is uh, committing a crime or going to commit a crime. That's the uh, or have committed crime. That is the officially restraining them and taking them ideally into custody. And use of force, reminder both for my own students that are criminal justice students and for those who are not. Police are given a very wide range of discretion when dealing with the general public. This is related to stop and searches and the use of force. But that's where the issue of use of force comes in. We'll talk a little bit about it when we talk specifically. But the use of force is officers are allowed to use, quote, appropriate force to apprehend a suspect or criminal if they are fleeing custody and that sort of thing. So we'll get into that as we talk about it. So on page 97, and literally from 97 to the end of the chapter, is all these different, in particular pieces and references to crimes. So we're going to kind of go through them together. But so on page 97, focusing on police and policing, knowing the data, what our author wants to do is look at the way that police mistreat people of color. And the two examples they chose were Michael Brown and Freddie Gray. In case you don't know either of those two cases, those are some of the earlier cases shortly after the Black Lives Matter movement began. Just a reminder that the Black Lives Matter movement began after the death of Trayvon Martin at the hand of a not even police officer, but a volunteer security individual. Um, and so these are all in the wake of that. And so Michael Brown is the first case, and it does emphasize that both of these cases were U.S. Department of Justice investigations. So it wasn't just internal. These were things that the U.S. DOJ actually looked into. Uh, and so Michael Brown was Ferguson, Missouri. Um, and Michael Brown was an individual who had gotten into a disagreement and essentially he was un unfairly shot. It gets super complicated. Um, but Michael Brown was shot and killed, and really the Justice Department found that it was violating constitutional rights of African Americans what that particular Ferguson Police Department was doing. The second example is the Freddie Gray case in Baltimore, Maryland. Um, and I don't know how much any of you know about Baltimore, Maryland, but uh, it is a particular jurisdiction in the state of Maryland that has a fairly high African American population, but it also has historically a very high rate of racial crime and um, hate. It's a very highly argued and fought area. But Freddie Gray was a slightly older uh, African American man who while being taken away in custody. He was already in handcuffs, taken into custody. Somehow his spine and neck were broken while within the vehicle. And then when they got out, he was obviously mostly paralyzed. And then he was actually, when they got him to a hospital, he was in a coma. Like, that shows that there was excessive force. If he was already within the vehicle, there was no need for that level of injury because he didn't have it before being placed in. It was a whole big issue. But in thinking about that, and again, this is just the two examples that the book chose to look at the overall idea of police and policing and this racial discrimination and biases. If, as we're talking about some of these cases, you go, oh yeah, I remember that name, or I don't remember that name. If you remember it, I mean, it's good that you remember, but it's bad because we shouldn't have to have a list of people that cause us to want to talk about these kinds of subjects. And if you don't know those names, it's not great because that also shows us how many people are in these situations. And again, it's good because, well, maybe that means that we can have this conversation, but it's still not good. I'm sorry. It's a hard subject. So, race and stops and searches, page 98. What we've talked about and what we've kind of covered already, and we actually have talked about in some of the other classes, but so stop and searches, as I already said, is an officer has the right to stop a suspicious individual and search their immediate vicinity, and I'll explain why that in a second, for any kind of illegal substance, paraphernalia, weapons, etc. So there is an issue of racial profiling. There is data to support that in stop and searches that African Americans are more likely to be subject to stop and searches than anyone else. And so clearly there is a racial bias. There is a tendency to stop African American individuals more frequently, not more likely, more frequently than white individuals. So we already see that there's an issue there. And the research that's available on this, uh, it involves three related dimensions, and that's what this next part really goes into. And that is that the first line of research looks at racial and ethnic proportions of people who are stopped with that actual proportion of the population. Uh, the second line is percentages of stopped civilians who have their vehicles or person searched. And then the third line is percentages of searches that uncover illegal contraband. And so, first line generally finds people of color are disproportionately stopped while walking or driving. Second line of research finds that when people of color are stopped, they're more likely than stopped whites to be searched. And then the third line finds that once searched, people of color are either, depending on the study, no more likely or even less likely than whites to possess illegal contraband. So, what we find is they are stopped more frequently. If they're stopped, they're searched more frequently, and they tend to have less contraband. It's almost like there is a racial profiling happening in stops and searches. Stops and searchings. Yes, that's a word that we can use that way. Okay, so I'm not going to go through it, but on page 99, selected studies of racial profiling. These are actual studies that you can find yourself that the book has provided for you And I believe actually even at the end of the chapter, yeah, the references for each chapter, they list all that information for you if you want to follow up on any of them. But just to pull a couple random, in Baltimore County, Maryland, African Americans comprise 50% of all traffic stops, even though they comprise only 27% of county residents. They are also more likely than stopped white drivers to be searched, but less likely to be found with illegal contraband. These trends also hold true for other areas of Maryland. Rector 2016. Let's pull in Vermont, African Americans and Latino drivers are several times more likely than white drivers to be stopped, even though they are less likely to be found with illegal contraband after being searched. Huh. In national survey evidence for the 2002 to 2011 period, 9.4% of African Americans who had some contact with the police during traffic or street stops, blah, 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 during the past year reported being searched, compared to 3.6 of Latinos and 2.8 of non-Latino white. Although these differences demonstrate racial disparity in police searches, this survey yielded no evidence of racial disparities in traffic or street stops, as the percentages of both types of stops involving African Americans or Latinos did not exceed that group's respective shares of the national population. Long story short, for that last one, the data shows yes, there is a disproportionately higher number, but statistically speaking, it was not abnormal because it didn't go outside of their general population percentage across the country. But again, that was a national survey, not a small percentage localized, looking at, Baltimore, New York City, Chicago, those kinds of places. All right. So, obviously, understanding racial profiling or racial disparity, as our text likes to also put out, is it only one or the other? So, racial profiling is something that I wish I could say is something that only police do, but it's something that everyday people do as well. Racial profiling is making assumptions based off of an individual's race or ethnicity. While there might be racial disproportionalities and issues across the system, it doesn't mean that there cannot be also racial profiling. And so it's important to remember that, going back to what I said earlier, the data may be there, but understanding the complicated nature of statistically significant data is a problem. And we will see that a little bit more with race and arrest. And so, all right. Evidence on race and arrest. Bottom of page 101. A notable study in the 1960s involved trained observers riding around in police cars. The study found that police were more likely to arrest African American suspects than white suspects, but it concluded that this disparity was due to factors other than the police racial biases. These factors were that African Americans were suspected of more serious crimes overall than white, African American suspects were more hostile than white towards police, and victims tended to prefer arrest more often when suspects were African American than when they were white. Before we talk about anything else, I want to repeat that and make sure that you are grasping what I'm saying. 1960s study found that police were more likely to arrest African American suspects than white suspects, not because of police racial bias, but because African Americans were suspected of more serious crimes. They were suspects, they were more hostile towards the police, and the victims of these crimes preferred arrest more often if the suspect was African American than white. Definitely not because of police racial bias. Okay, but it's still racially biased if we look at that third part itself, not even counting the first and second part. We have an issue here. Some other observational studies also find that these factors explain why police are more likely to arrest African American suspects. Although the police might be on their best behavior when they know they're being observed, these studies still suggest that arrest is not racially motivated. So if you remember, way back at the beginning of this slideshow, when I said scholars dispute the extent of discrimination in the modern CJ system, it's a myth or it's still a racist and deliberate system. Right there, you're seeing data. You're seeing actual research studies that say it's a myth. It's not racially motivated. It is its own separate thing. Complicating the picture, other research does find racial bias in arrests, especially when the crime victim is white, which we kind of already saw a little bit, and especially for misdemeanor offenses when police practice zero tolerance policing aimed at clearing streets of minor offenders. So, real quick, for those of you who do not know what a zero tolerance policing is, zero tolerance policing is a very harsh form of policing specifically for small misdemeanors. A felony is a serious crime that usually causes some serious harm, and so arrest makes sense. But misdemeanors can oftentimes be just a fine or things of that nature. The idea of zero tolerance policy is it doesn't matter why you're doing it, we are going to punish you to the harshest extent of the law. No tolerance. You did this, you're in trouble. There's no wiggle room on it. So the mixed findings on this issue prompted two expert reviews to conclude a decade or more ago, roughly, almost 2 decades ago, because 2007, that the evidence overall on racial bias in arrest was inconclusive. Inconclusive means that cannot confirm or deny. And this gets to the point that I tried to remind you that we're going to take that middle approach. The issue with this is that, yes, there is data that shows us 100% for sure there is bias in racially charged bias in policing. But we also have equal amounts of data that say it's not officers that are racist, it's other things. And it's like that there's an issue here. We don't have enough data to prove, yes, 100%, I can say this. However, there has been, and this one, the more recent one was 2011, systemic review that drew firmer conclusion. They were not going inconclusive. They made a strong stance. Taking into account non-racial factors like seriousness of crime that could affect arrest, the review found that the average probability of arrest for minority suspects in the studies it examined was 26% compared to only 20% for white suspects. So right there, looking at just that math, 26 to 20%, not really that much. But doing a little math, minority suspects were thus 30% more likely than white suspects to be arrested. This is a strongly and strikingly consistent pattern of race effects. The end-all, be-all piece is the last sentence of that paragraph. We report with confidence that the results are not mixed. Race matters. And that's kind of the point. In all this that we've been talking about, there is issues of race. Race matters whether it's from the police standpoint or from the everyday citizen standpoint. There are racial biases and racist ideologies that are all around us. And they play a factor in all of this. And so we need to know it to hopefully overcome it. So 2 other racial biases that came up from this that has an influence on arrest, I think we really should just briefly talk about. Strength of the evidence and skin tone. So obviously, strength of the evidence is pretty straightforward. But typically what we see is if strength of the evidence for a case against a white felon or a white convicted individual, if it's not strong enough that someone would be like, oh yeah, for sure, they won't proceed. But if the evidence is lacking a little bit, but it's for a person of color, they'll still push it forward. So there's a weird shift in whether or not the evidence is strong and whether or not the suspect is white or not. But the other one is skin tone, the skin color. And that's something that's interesting. White individuals, white men who have darker skin complexions, Mediterranean, European, those darker complexions, they saw higher rates than their whiter white individuals. So we see that sometimes the bias is based solely on how someone looks, which brings up a very disheartening term from the pre-civil rights era of the African American community and the concept of passing. It's a term that's still used today, and it's used also for the trans community now. But the idea of passing, that uh, an African American individual who was light skinned enough to pass as a white person was going to be less likely to be in trouble than a darker complexioned individual. And so this is a real issue, and why it's interesting to note that skin tone does affect even white men. So it's important just to understand this. So, of course, the little subsection race and arrest for drug offenses. Not that we haven't already talked about it before, but the evidence of racial ethnic discrimination in arrest is especially pronounced in arrest for drug offenses. Chapters 1 and 3 pointed out, so this is review, but African Americans and to a smaller extent Latinx individuals are disproportionately arrested for drug offenses, possession or sale, even though they're not more likely than white to use or sell illegal drugs. The war against drugs, then, has been very racially discriminatory. And that's something we've already talked about. Richard Nixon's war on drugs and Reagan's continuing war on drugs. That was all racially informed. It wasn't meant to be this positive, happy-go-lucky, let's get rid of bad drugs. It was meant to demonize the disenfranchised, the people that they didn't like, and that led to serious issues. And so, yes, we see that drug offenses are racially disproportionate. And you notice the big sigh, hopefully. Now we're going to talk about the use of force, but unfortunately, as I've stated several times, in particular, page 103, which is where this starts, to 109, is talking about this issue and looking at several cases. So, this is where things get really heavy. Not that they weren't already heavy. So, race and police use of force is perhaps one of the things I feel like I don't have to talk about the most, but we still need to talk about. If you are familiar with the concept of use of force, as we already briefly mentioned before, it is I don't want to say right because it's not a right, but it's the right of the police officer to use a certain amount of force in apprehending a suspect of a crime. Even if they're wrong, they technically have that right. However, the idea is that there are or should be limits. Typically speaking, it's supposed to be that the use of force cannot exceed the danger or the threat of danger to innocent bystanders or the officer themselves. So you can't use lethal force, which means to kill someone, for someone who is smoking marijuana. That is a very excessive use of force. If someone is just walking away, you do not have the right to run them down with your car. Like excessive use of force. And unfortunately, what we see in all of these cases that we're going to bring up here, and what I'm going to try to do is rapid succession, are African American males who lost their lives from being shot or several other options by officers when, technically speaking, that level of crime, that level of running away or fleeing authorities, it was not warranted for the level of force that was used. And so, right off the bat, the first thing under race and police use of force is Trayvon Martin, as I mentioned. That's the start of the Black Lives Matter movement. Uh, and then after Martin's killing, other national attention grabbing headlines of African American men who were killed by police officers literally are the entirety of page 104 and 105. Eric Garner, Michael Brown, which I already mentioned, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, again also mentioned, Philando Castile, Terrence Crutcher, Stephon Clark. We could also mention Breonna Taylor. We can mention George Floyd. There's so many individuals that are African American that have lost their lives because of police exercising their right to use force in apprehending a suspect. But the upside, which it's hard to say there's an upside, is that some of these cases did lead to individuals, the officers, not essentially being stripped of rank and being charged for homicide, which is fair. They should be charged with homicide. But not all of them were found in favor of the victims. And that's why I said this is a heavy subject. This is not rainbows and butterflies. This isn't the extreme amount of African Americans and people of color in prisons because they're chosen based off of the color of their skin to be arrested. No, these are people whose lives are taken away just because of the color of their skin, and that is not okay. And I am already starting to tear up. So this is why I said this is not an easy subject. I don't think we really need to dig deep into this because it has been such a front and center thing. We all, if you've watched the news or heard the news over the past decade, you've heard of at least one of these. And so that's, even the book goes, these are just 7 of the many deaths of African Americans from police use of force in the past few years. The continuing concern, which is on page 106 after all of this, also called police violence, is long been an issue for communities for people of color. Like, this is not new. And that's kind of the even more depressing thing. This is not a new thing. Police violence towards people of color have been going on since the beginning of our policing. At the time, it was slaves, which still are people, but they were given that right. The law said you can do it. Now the law says you can't, but they still do it. And there's this long held disillusion. This, there is no fantasy that police are there to help people of color. And that's unfortunate because the role of a police officer is supposed to be to protect and serve the community that they're in. Protect and serve the community. Not the rich white people, not the white people, the community, everyone in it. And when we have this kind of issue continuing and still happening to this day, this is the problem. When we go back to the ACAB, all cops are bastards. The reason I say George Floyd is the straw that broke the camel's back for everyday people using it is because for the longest time, there were still white individuals who believed that Black Lives Matter and things like that, but it was not as high of a number. But 2020 saw a rise in numbers of people from all different races and backgrounds, genders, sexualities, ethnicities, people of all kinds coming together and saying this is not okay. And that's kind of the takeaway that we should get from this is the sad reality is that it took us this long to combine together and say this is a real problem. But I think, not that I think, I hope that we as a species of human beings can get past some of our prejudices and work to eliminate these kinds of systemic issues. Systemic just means it's ingrained within the system. If we can work together, who knows? Under the continuing concern at the bottom of the page, law professor Kristen Henning brings up something, and I do want to bring up this quote. Black parents tell their children to always keep your hands where they can see them, avoid sudden movements, and behave in a courteous and respectful manner towards officers. That's the world we live in. That we have to tell and teach young children, specifically children of color, but we have to teach young children that you need to behave this way and do these things when engaging with an officer, or you might be killed. That's not what should be. Doesn't matter your race, doesn't matter anything else. We shouldn't have to be teaching this to our children. Just because someone is not courteous doesn't mean they're a threat. Just because you don't have your hands in plain sight doesn't mean that you're grabbing a weapon. Again, that gets into a deeper psychological issue with policing, and we talk about that in policing anyway, but my point is there is a less than happy part to all this. Not that there wasn't a less than happy part already. So, the evidence we have. Do all these racial disparities reflect racial bias? In terms of research, difficult to say. As I said, the statistics significance, that's the issue here. So, the last part of the chapter, literally going from the end of 107 to 109, just kind of covers all this. Reliable data on police use of force are sorely lacking. Twice as many civilians die annually from police shootings than the number estimated by the FBI and the National Vital Statistics System. A lot of these researchers had to pull from the Washington Post, the Guardian, newspapers that report on these things that don't get reported to these large databases. So there is gaps in this kind of data and lack of reliability for this. Second, even if reliable data for fatal shootings were available, there are no reliable data for non-fatal shootings, because that's the other thing. We only talk about the fatal shootings, but the reality is there are non-fatal ones. Civilians are actually struck by bullets in only about 1/3 to 1/2 of police shootings, and they die in only about 1/3 of the time when struck. So putting that all together, roughly civilians die 9 to 17% of the time when police try to shoot them, which means that is a whole lot of shootings that are going unaccounted for. And then, even if the data shows that people of color are more likely to experience police use of force, that may occur more often because they commit serious violent crime and are confronted by police. And this is where we get some awkward data, like African Americans and Latinx together account for about 60% of violent crime arrests, which we've talked about before. So, because of that, that leads to that number being higher. African Americans' overrepresentation in police violence may also reflect possibility they may be more likely to resist arrest, or the fact that police more heavily patrol high crime urban areas, which tend to be largely African American. There are several possibilities for this problem. And then this implicit bias and use of force. Some research on implicit bias shows subjects, whether civilians or police, as we talked about before. Uh, this is actually one of the studies I was mentioning. They showed civilians or police both photographs or videos that depict African Americans and white men holding either a gun or other object, such as cell phone or wallet. Subjects are asked to press a shoot button if the man is armed, or a don't shoot if they're unarmed. Uh, Depends on the actual study, but overall finds that they're more likely to shoot armed black men than armed white men, and do so more quickly, and they're more likely to shoot unarmed black men than unarmed white men. However, one study found that police were less likely to shoot African American suspects and to take a longer time to shoot, maybe because of the idea that they were being analyzed and trying to avoid being perceived as racist. There are questions of legitimacy for that point. But bringing it all together, understanding that we can and probably should agree that there is racial bias in the system. Is it necessarily racist officers? No, I think it's more complicated than that. Um, yeah, like I said, this was such a hard and difficult topic to talk about that I'm not sure how to really end this on like a happy note. I don't think I can. Um, I guess how we end this is saying that um, there are issues for race and policing, and they are deeply entrenched historically, and they're complicated. And if there was an easy answer, I wish we could come to that and solve it quicker, but unfortunately, we can't. So, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for sticking it through this lecture. I know this wasn't easy. I know this was a tougher one. So please feel free to take this in parts, take breaks, um, and I will see you all relatively soon. Um, yeah, don't stress too much. This is a very depressing topic, but hopefully, we can make it a little bit better in the next ones. All right. Bye, everyone.